Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the channel. For today, we will be doing another watch review. For this particular watch, it is going to be another Seiko, if it wasn't already clear in the title of the video. But for today, we'll be looking at a more recent reissue of a Seiko, and that reissue is going to be this Seiko X Nano Universe. This is known as the Chariot, even though it looks like the word chariot. But this is the reference SCXP051, also known as the Steve Jobs, and we'll be sure to kind of go into a little more depth about the watch, why it's been given the name Steve Jobs, and just kind of get the overview of the watch in general to sort of get a closer look at it. For today's wrist review, or wrist check, I am wearing this Casio MQ24-9B. I know it's a pretty elegant name for a watch, but this is also a smaller timepiece, and surprisingly it is about the same exact dimensions as this Seiko that we're going to take a closer look at. So without any further ado, let's change some perspective and take a closer look at the Seiko right now. Alright, so now that we see it from this angle, before we go any further, let's get some of the specifications out of the way. So the movement that's powering this watch is known as the Seiko Caliber 7N01. It's a quartz movement, if that wasn't already apparent by the ticking seconds hand, and it is rated to about plus or minus 15 seconds a month, so not necessarily a spectacular quartz movement, but it still works pretty well. Because it is quartz, it obviously does have a hacking seconds hand. The water resistance on this watch is okay. It's about 5 bar or about 50 meters, so it can definitely take a few splashes, but it definitely can't go swimming in the pool with you. The crystal that's covering the watch, Seiko is just calling it glass. Unfortunately, I'm not too sure if it is glass as in their Hardlex glass or if it's a different type of material that is covering the watch, but nonetheless it's covered. If it's a question to anybody, Seiko does say that this watch does have some anti-magnetic properties to it. As to which extent, unfortunately, I was not able to find out, but I'm assuming that this watch doesn't have the same anti-magnetic properties that a Omega will have, or perhaps even a Rolex Milgauss, but unfortunately, none of that information can be confirmed, at least at this time in the research I was able to do. So with that out of the way, let's get some of the dimensions of the watch checked out right now. So one thing about the watch that you might be able to kind of see, especially from the opening, is that this watch is actually pretty small, but it stays very faithful to the original release of this watch back in the early 80s. How original that might be? We'll take a closer look right now. So the size of the watch without the crown is 33 millimeters. With the crown, we'll be looking at about 35 millimeters, 39 from lug to lug on the watch. The lug width spacing right here is about 18 millimeters, so it's not very large. And then the thickness is roughly about 6 millimeters high. So when this watch originally came out, it was, by today's standards, pretty small, and the watch didn't have to be too large, and it doesn't really have to be too large as a re-release either, because it's able to stay faithful to the original release and the sizing of it. But some of the backstory about this particular timepiece and why it's called the Steve Jobs is back in 1984, there was a photographer by the name of Norman Seif, I hope I'm pronouncing the last name correctly, who took a photo of Steve Jobs in his Woodside, California home with the first Macintosh computer, and it's a somewhat famous photo of Time magazine and of Steve Jobs in general, but on his wrist you'll see the original version of this watch, and that watch actually was sold back in 2016 at a heritage auctions for $42,500. Now, the other references from that year probably won't be commanding the same price, and if you are interested in trying to find out what watch that was specifically, it's the reference 6431-6030. So there might be some out there floating around, but if you don't want to do the hunting and you don't want to have to deal with the potential for the watch completely dying out and having to replace a brand new movement, you can always go for this particular one, because this is, again, very faithful to the sizing of that original Seiko. Now, there are some other variations of the Seiko that came out during that time. Seiko did release this watch with collaboration for Nano Universe, which is essentially a clothing company based out of Japan. And there were 4 different variations of this watch that were released when this came out. There was this white dial variant in 33 millimeters. There was another white dial variant in about 37.5 millimeters, so just slightly larger. And then there was another variant with the same sizes, but instead of a white dial, had a black dial with white indices. So these ones were limited edition of 1,982 pieces, or 1982, and the black dial variants were limited editions of 300 pieces. But Seiko recently announced that there's another set of these watches coming out, I believe with a stainless steel case that isn't this black IP coating, but instead is more of a satin finished stainless steel with, I believe it was a cream dial, but I'll be sure to kind of post a photo of it to show that there are some different variations of this watch if this one particularly does not excite you or is not of your fancy. Now, it is pretty minimalist. Just by looking at the watch, you can be able to see that there is not a whole lot of things going on. It's a pretty straightforward watch, 3 hands, Seiko quartz, and it definitely has a ton of minimalistic elements to it, which I find kind of appealing, but maybe too boring and too stale for some people's taste, which is totally understandable, and considering the size, it's not for everybody and their preferences. But again, the case is an IP black coating, and Seiko has done this before. There was a video that I did with a Seiko Core Solar model that had a very similar coating to this, but instead of it being this kind of satin, almost matte finish, it was more of a shiny finish. But it is pretty nice. There's a shot of the crown, not signed crown, but there's not a whole lot of markings on this particular watch to begin with. The case back of the watch is okay. You can be able to check out right here. It has that anti-magnetic property that I was kind of speaking about a little bit earlier, with that upside down kind of horseshoe looking symbol there. But it does have a vertically brushed portion right here, and then on the outside this kind of ring that's been of a high polish as well. But you're probably not going to be looking too much at the back other than the number that you got, but for the most part it's just a case back. It does have a just a simple pin buckle here. It's not signed at all, but it still does have that black IP coating that the watch case has. And it's not spectacular, but at about 18 millimeters of the strap width, you can be able to kind of change it out with a few options, not a whole lot, but just a few. And it is pretty interesting. I mean, you have to kind of admit, it's kind of cool that Seiko was able to do a pure re-release like this and stay faithful to the original sizing and proportions that the 80s version had. So to put it on the wrist to show just kind of how small it wears into comparison about some other watches that I've had here and just in general sizing for today. Right there. So it wears pretty small, and unlike the other watches I've kind of had on here, it does not hang over the wrist at all. As you can be able to see, it fits perfectly, at least on my wrist, but maybe it's a little too small on some people's wrists, at least with this size, but no overhang from the lugs whatsoever. And it's kind of nice because they do curve down ever so slightly to sort of give a little bit more of a gentle slope and not just a straight protrusion from the case. So this is the Seiko X Nano Universe Chariot, not Chariot from my understanding. The T is silent, and this is the SCXP051, and it's a pretty interesting watch, but again, not to everybody's taste because of that size. Before I head out, I do want to say thank you very, very much to 10 subscribers so far. I know that does not sound like a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, but I was happy with 1 subscriber, and with 10 subscribers, I just want to say thank you so much for sticking around, and there'll be more content to come. So if you have any further questions or any comments, put it down in the section below, and I'll kind of help out and kind of talk about watches a little bit with everybody. But thank you very much for sticking around and checking out this Seiko watch. Take care, guys.